The moment I stepped onto the porch of my newly purchased home, a deep sense of satisfaction settled over me, a feeling of accomplishment that had taken years of hard work to achieve. But that sense of peace was short-lived because within just a few days of moving in, I found an envelope taped to my front door, the stark red HOA logo glaring at me like a warning sign I had failed to notice before signing the deed. At first, I assumed it was just a generic welcome packet, a set of community rules and regulations that I could skim through and ignore. But as I unfolded the letter, my eyes widened in disbelief. Karen, the self-proclaimed ruler of the Homeowners Association, had the audacity to inform me that my property, despite legally belonging to me, was considered part of the HOA's jurisdiction, and therefore I was required to pay monthly community rent to remain in my own house. My initial reaction was laughter, a short, incredulous chuckle at what had to be some kind of clerical error. But as I kept reading, my amusement twisted into frustration. The letter explicitly stated that the previous owner had failed to file a specific exemption form when opting out of the HOA years ago, meaning that, according to Karen, my home was now subject to their fees, rules, and regulations, including the absurd requirement to pay rent as if I were nothing more than a tenant in my own investment. Clutching the paper in my hands, I stormed inside and immediately dug through my closing documents, searching for any mention of this so-called obligation, and sure enough, there wasn't a single line clause or even a footnote indicating that I was bound to the HOA's ridiculous demands. Determined to shut this nonsense down before it got out of hand, I decided to pay Karen a visit at the HOA office, a small, overly decorated building at the entrance of the neighborhood, where she sat behind a polished mahogany desk with a smug expression that made my blood simmer. Before I could even sit down, she launched into a condescending speech about how community cohesion required financial contributions from all homeowners, and when I pointed out that my property wasn't part of the HOA, she scoffed and said, "Well, according to our records, it is." I wasn't about to let some glorified neighborhood dictator extort me, so I laid my documents out in front of her, highlighting the parts that explicitly stated my home was a standalone property. But instead of conceding, she simply smiled, a slow, knowing grin that sent a chill down my spine, and said, "You can take it up with our legal team if you want, but I promise you, fighting this will be much more expensive than just paying the rent." Her arrogance was staggering. The sheer gall to threaten me with legal fees in an attempt to strong-arm me into submission, but she had picked the wrong homeowner to mess with. Instead of arguing further, I calmly gathered my papers, met her gaze with an icy stare, and said, "Fine. If you want to play dirty, let's play." As I walked out of that office, my mind was already racing with plans to dismantle her scheme, to expose whatever fraudulent tactics she was using to manipulate homeowners into paying fees they didn't owe, and to ensure that she regretted ever trying to pull this stunt on me. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with, but she was about to find out the hard way. I left Karen's office seething, but I knew anger alone wouldn't solve this mess. If she wanted to drag me into a legal battle, I was more than willing to fight, but I needed ammunition, solid evidence to prove her claims were nothing but a power-hungry attempt to extort me. That night, I pulled out every document I had related to my home purchase and scoured them for any loopholes or fine print I might have missed. Nothing, not a single clause tied my property to the HOA. But Karen had seemed so confident, so smug, as if she knew something I didn't, and that meant I needed to dig deeper. I started by reaching out to my real estate agent, who was just as perplexed as I was. That house was never under the HOA, she assured me. The previous owner opted out years ago, and that's why it was listed as a non-HOA property. That only fueled my suspicions. If the house had been free of HOA obligations when it was sold, how was Karen claiming otherwise now? Determined to uncover the truth, I headed to the county records office the next day and requested all legal filings related to my property, including historical HOA documentation. What I found made my blood boil. Karen had filed a retroactive claim with the county, attempting to reclassify my house as part of the HOA's jurisdiction after I had purchased it. She had essentially tried to rewrite history, and she had done it under the assumption that I wouldn't notice. That assumption was about to cost her. Armed with proof of her deception, I contacted a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes. He whistled low when I showed him the forged filing. "This is blatant fraud," he said. "She has no legal standing to force you into the HOA. If anything, she's in violation of state property laws." That was exactly what I needed to hear. The next step was to formally challenge Karen's fraudulent claim. My lawyer drafted a cease and desist letter demanding that she retract her illegal filing and remove any associated fees from my name. But I wasn't stopping there. If Karen had done this to me, how many other homeowners had she scammed? I started talking to my neighbors, casually bringing up HOA fees in conversation. The responses were more revealing than I expected. Several homeowners mentioned that their fees had suddenly increased in the last year, and at least 2 of them had received similar notices about community rent. Karen had been running the scam for a while, and no one had questioned it. With my lawyer's help, I organized a neighborhood meeting, inviting homeowners who had been affected by Karen's fraudulent fees. At first, people were hesitant. Karen had a reputation for being ruthless, and no one wanted to risk her wrath. But when I laid out the county documents proving she had been falsifying HOA boundaries, the mood shifted. Anger replaced fear, and one by one, people started sharing their own horror stories. Unjust fines, sudden fee hikes, threats of legal action for minor infractions. Karen had turned the HOA into her personal dictatorship, and no one had dared to challenge her until now. The next day, a formal complaint was filed against the HOA with the State Housing Board. Karen was about to have her entire operation scrutinized by authorities, and I wasn't done yet. While my lawyer handled the legal battle, I focused on the court of public opinion. I compiled all my findings into an expose and sent it to local news outlets. Within a week, the story blew up. HOA president accused of fraudulent practices became the headline plastered across news websites and social media. Karen, once the untouchable queen of the neighborhood, was now facing serious public scrutiny. But the real turning point came when an anonymous tip, likely from someone inside the HOA, revealed that Karen had been embezzling community funds. She had been using HOA money to finance her lavish lifestyle, expensive vacations, designer clothes, and even a luxury car, all while demanding that homeowners pay inflated fees. That was the final nail in the coffin. A full-scale audit was launched, and Karen's empire began to crumble. Yet, despite everything, she refused to back down. Instead of admitting defeat, she doubled down, sending me another letter demanding immediate payment of my rent. This time, I didn't bother responding with words. I let my lawyer do the talking with a lawsuit. Karen's arrogance knew no bounds. Despite the mounting evidence against her, she continued to act as if she was untouchable, convinced that no one would have the resources or the backbone to take her down. But she underestimated me, and that was her biggest mistake. With the lawsuit officially filed, I knew I had to make my next moves carefully. The case wasn't just about me anymore. Karen's fraudulent actions had affected multiple homeowners, and the more people who came forward, the stronger our case would be. Over the next few weeks, my lawyer and I worked tirelessly to gather more testimonies from neighbors who had been victims of Karen's shady dealings. The most shocking discovery came when an elderly couple, who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, confided in me that they had been paying HOA special assessments for repairs that never happened. She told us our house wasn't up to code, the wife explained, wringing her hands. We were scared we'd get fined or even evicted if we didn't pay. My lawyer's eyes narrowed at the revelation. "That's extortion," he said grimly. "She's been preying on vulnerable homeowners for years." That was the final push we needed. Our lawsuit would no longer be just a dispute over fees. It would be a full-blown fraud and embezzlement case. While the legal process played out, I focused on one of the most powerful tools available to me: public exposure. The initial news coverage of Karen's fraudulent HOA practices had caused a stir, but I wanted to make sure the story didn't fade away before justice was served. I compiled all the evidence into a well-documented report and posted it on every local community forum I could find. The response was explosive. Comments flooded in from residents in nearby neighborhoods, some sharing similar experiences with corrupt HOAs, while others expressed their outrage over Karen's abuse of power. Within days, the story was picked up by larger news stations, and reporters began reaching out for interviews. Karen, of course, tried to do damage control. She sent out a desperate HOA-wide email claiming that the allegations were nothing more than a personal attack from a disgruntled homeowner, me, who didn't understand the rules. She painted herself as the victim, claiming that everything she did was to maintain the integrity of the community. But it was too late. People weren't buying it. The real estate market in our area had already taken a hit because of the controversy, and homeowners who had previously stayed silent now feared that their property values would plummet if Karen remained in power. The final blow came when the HOA board, under immense pressure from the community, held an emergency meeting. It was a packed event, with homeowners showing up in droves, many holding copies of the expose I had circulated. Karen sat at the head of the table, her usual smugness replaced with barely concealed rage. As I stood to present my case, I made sure to keep my voice calm and measured. "This isn't just about me," I said, looking around the room. "It's about every single homeowner here who has been forced to pay fees they didn't owe, who has been threatened with fines and legal action over false claims. It's about an HOA president who has abused her position for personal gain." Karen interrupted, her voice shrill. "That's a blatant lie. I have done nothing but enforce the community guidelines." My lawyer, seated beside me, held up a thick stack of documents. "We have proof of at least a dozen fraudulent claims filed under your name, financial discrepancies in the HOA's budget, and multiple homeowners willing to testify that they were coerced into paying illegitimate fees," he stated firmly. "Would you like to continue denying the allegations?" Karen's face turned a deep shade of red, but before she could respond, one of the board members, a man who had previously supported her, cleared his throat and stood. "Karen," he said carefully, "we've also reviewed the financial reports, and we can't ignore the inconsistencies. There's over $100,000 in unaccounted HOA funds." Gasps rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of anger. Karen shot to her feet. "You can't do this. I built this community. Everything I did was to protect our neighborhood. But the damage was done." The board voted to remove her as HOA president effective immediately, and an independent audit was launched into the association's finances. Karen, still refusing to admit defeat, stormed out of the meeting, but her troubles were far from over. With the lawsuit still in motion, the State Housing Board conducting its own investigation, and now an internal audit exposing her financial misdeeds, Karen's empire was crumbling at an unstoppable rate. A month later, she was formally charged with fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of authority, and when her assets were frozen pending trial, it was revealed that she had been using HOA funds to pay her own mortgage. The poetic justice of it all wasn't lost on me. She had tried to charge me rent for my own home, and now she couldn't even afford to keep hers. In the end, justice prevailed. The court ruled in my favor, and not only was I absolved of all HOA fees, but Karen was ordered to pay restitution to every homeowner she had defrauded. The HOA was restructured under new leadership, and safeguards were put in place to prevent another Karen from rising to power. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my home in peace, knowing that I had stood my ground and won. Karen had learned the hard way that power unchecked was power lost, and I had proven that no matter how untouchable someone thinks they are, the truth always has a way of catching up. And the best part, that smug look on her face was gone for good.